What should I do with the items that are left over after a spell? This is one of my most frequently asked questions, and it's probably because so many different practitioners have different ways of doing it. I would refer to these items as spell remains, and today we're talking about the different ways that you can dispose of them. Now, spell remains can be any number of different things. It's really going to depend on your style of practice. It could be burnt out candles, it could be wax that's been used in a wax reading, it could be petitions or sigils, it could be bottles, jars, bags, poppets, it could be incense that's been left behind, ashes that have been left behind, magical waters that you aren't sure what to do with anymore. There are so many different things that you might be left with, and it can be really confusing to know what to do with them and when. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a breakdown of the different things you could do with them. It's then up to you to decide what's best for your practice, what falls in line with your tradition, what is best to keep you safe, what is best to keep the environment safe, as well as local animals and wildlife. Up first is reuse. I would always recommend trying to extend the life of your magical items as much as possible. It makes it more cost effective, and it often makes it energetically quite efficient. Now, of course, this isn't applicable to everything. That petition might not be useful a second time around, and the incense that you've burned definitely isn't going to magically rematerialize again. But if you're using crystals, jars, bottles, bags, these are the kind of things that can be reused over and over again. The way you do this is going to depend on your tradition and often involves other disposal methods, but really briefly, if we're using something like crystals again, you might want to give them a bit of a clean. Now, do be mindful that some crystals will gradually dissolve in water, so that's maybe not the best for all of them. But if they can be washed, you might need to give them a wash just to get off any remains of ashes, any herbs, any wax that might be on them. Once those crystals are clean, you can then give them a cleanse. I have lots of different videos on cleansing, but there's a few ways that you can do it, including using smoke. Personally, I like using rosemary. Other people really like using lavender. It's very much going to depend on your tradition. You might want to use sound. You might want to manually remove energy from those crystals. It's really up to you what resonates with you. And once cleansed, those crystals can then be reused all over again in a completely different working. If we're using bottles and jars, as long as the contents inside have been removed, you can clean them and then cleanse them and then reuse them again. Now, what you do with the items inside is very much going to depend on the intention of those items. We will be touching on that in just a moment. This is a little bit jumbled simply because there's so many crossovers between different techniques. If you're using poppets or bags, same again, they can be opened, the items can be removed, they can be cleaned or cleansed and then reused in a different working. Candles can also be reused in certain circumstances. It really depends on how you've used that candle. If you've used that candle as a vessel for energy, so you might have carved sigils on it, you might have anointed it with oil, you might have dressed it in powder, you might have filled it full of your energy, that candle is integrally linked to the working that you've just done and really needs to be burned down completely to remove all of that excess energy. However, if you're only using a candle as an elemental representation of, say, the fire element, or you're using it as a focal point for your working, say in a working that requires scrying or meditation, then that candle can very easily be reused again. You might want to cleanse it a little bit, but otherwise it's perfectly fine to reuse. This is where the nuances in witchcraft really come into play, because it very much depends on the style of candle magic that you carry out. But typically I would recommend, if you can use something twice, 3 times, 4 times, that you do so. It's going to make your practice way more manageable in the long run. You're not going to need half as many items. It's going to be friendlier on your budget and your coin purse, and generally it's just going to be better for the environment as well. To expand on reusing items, we can also include items into new spells and rituals. This is especially true in items that perhaps can't be used in any spell, but could very much be used in something of a similar intention. The most famous technique would be using the ashes from incenses in black salt. We are taking something that otherwise would end up in the bin and we are including it into another item that can be used magically. Now, with the ashes, you can really use any kind of ashes as long as they really are a powder. This might be petition ashes, this might be sigil ashes, this might be loose incense ashes or stick incense ashes. How many times can I say ashes in a sentence? A lot, apparently. And you grind them down and you mix them into salt along with charcoal and perhaps some herbs with your intention to create a protective black salt. That's really the most famous technique, but we can take this a step further. Those candles that I said may well be too linked to the initial working could be added into a future working. We see the idea of eternal flames being really prevalent within certain traditions traditions, such as those who kept Bridget's eternal flame alive, we can see that idea being applied similarly in spells and rituals, where if we have a working that we want to extend longer term, you might want to use the little bit of an old candle that's left behind from a previous prosperity working to continue that prosperity working by lighting the next candle that you're using, essentially creating an eternal working that you're consistently adding more energy into. Now, do we need workings to be eternal? No, but sometimes it can be useful if you know that you need a little bit of extra energy in a spell or ritual, but maybe you don't have a candle that's big enough to be able to extend the working out by using several candles in quick succession. Once one is nearly burned out, we can then add it to another one. Once that one's nearly burned out, we add it to another one. Now, if we have a lot of a candle left behind, we can use that entire candle in a working that's very similar. So if the first candle spell that you did was about finding prosperity in your job, you can then take that candle and add it into a working to gain a promotion in that same job. It's a similar intention, it's still all about the prosperity, but you can add more on top of it. This means that any items that are left behind, like crystals that are really, really covered in wax and stuff, and you find them really hard to clean, you can then just shift them into a slightly different working. So prosperity to prosperity, protection to protection. It also means that all of the energy that was built up in that item before is simply going to be transferred into this new working. You're essentially layering up on your intentions. This also applies to petitions and sigils if you have created them but have not destroyed them yet, and it's very, very similar to what it is that you're aiming for. You can add them into this working as well. Now, you can take this a step further again and use actual full-on spell remains that are literally unusable in any other way and add them into spell bags. So as an example, if you have done, I keep going back to candle workings because that's what I am most used to doing. If you've done a candle spell and all that's left behind is some wax that is melted off that candle and some herbs that have become congealed and have solidified in that melted wax, you can then take that melted wax from, say, that protection working, and you can add it into a pouch for protection. You then add additional herbs in there, additional energy, perhaps tag locks and items of representation. You seal it up, you charge that bag, you can then carry that round with you. Not only do you have the energy and the association that you put into that spell bag, but then you also have all of that energy and intention that you put into that original candle spell, which means you can then carry that working forwards. It means that we can essentially amplify all of the workings that we're doing because we're adding in energy that's left over from the working that came before. Now, of course, this isn't going to be applicable with everything, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend hoarding your spell items for a just-in-case moment that you might do something similar, but if you know that you do a lot of prosperity workings, or you know that you do a lot of protection workings. Those two are the ones that I think are most commonly used for this purpose. It's great to kind of add items in, especially if you're working, say, towards the success of your business. If you've already done one business success spell and you're about to do another one, take something from that initial working into the new working. You can also carry these pouches around. You can put some of those herbs into a locket so that you can wear it while you're at your job. You can put some of these herbs into your wallet in a little pouch for a similar purpose. It allows us to expand that energy going forwards, and people do this generally. Some practitioners will include coins in prosperity workings. Even if the coin doesn't necessarily have an active role in that working, it means that that coin has been charged with prosperity. They then put that in with the rest of their coins as a way of magnifying their energy over and over again with all of the money that gets added in. It's one of those topics where you can really expand and adapt this into so many different forms, but I do find this to be really useful if you have items that you really don't want to just get rid of. Like, say you've had an incredible working and the energy was so high, this is a way to really keep that going. Now, the reality is there are always going to be items that you are not going to need. Like, even if you are reusing items, even if you are adding them into further spells and rituals, there's always going to be workings where maybe you're only going to do it once. Perhaps you did a banishing spell, or perhaps a binding, maybe even a curse, maybe it was a love spell or something for new beginnings. Maybe you've already got your new beginning and you don't need another one, so why would you keep those items? You're going to have to do something with those items. And there's lots of different ways that this can go, but one option is to return them to the earth. Now, the big caveat to this is that the only items you should be putting in the earth are things that can be naturally degraded, that are not going to harm the environment or any of the animals that live within it, and that you are not encroaching on anyone's private land or property. You got to make sure that you're really keeping yourself and the natural environment safe. And so some things are perfectly suitable to return to the earth. If you've used moon water in a scrying working, you might not want want to keep that moon water afterwards because now it's been exposed to the air, it might have dust in it and bits in it, not really sure what to do with it, so you can then dispose of it by returning it to the earth. Maybe water a plant or go to one of your local trees, and as you're building a connection with that tree, you can offer some of that water as a way of returning it in a cyclical energy back to the earth again. If you have ashes that are left behind or herbs that are left behind after a spell or ritual, you might want to return those to the earth as well. Paper, as long as it is paper and not plasticized paper, can also be returned to the earth in the form of petitions, sigils, and the like. This is also a way of destroying sigils to activate them. This doesn't have to be the physical earth. This could be a plant pot. This could be the compost heap, whatever it is that you have access to. You can, however, take this a step further. Did I warn you that my content is usually quite nuanced and I tend to go off on tangents? If not, welcome to my channel. An alternative way of doing it would be to take something like, I'm going to use the example of prosperity again because it fits the example very well. If you have items left over that are associated with a prosperity working, and you have a basil plant in your kitchen, you might want to return, say, the petition into that basil plant. Bury it into the earth underneath that basil plant and link the energy of that petition to that plant. That way, you can tell how successful your working is being based on the health of that plant. If it's doing really well, then your working is likely doing really well too. If it's doing really badly, your working might need some assistance too. And it goes vice versa. The better you tend to the plant, the more energy is going into that petition, the more successful it's going to be. This is a way of continuing your workings whilst also returning it to the earth. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of interconnecting pieces when it comes to spell disposal. It isn't quite as cut and dry as do this or do that. Usually there's lots of crossover in the middle. Now, this can also be tied to baneful workings as well. If you have a plant in your garden that is dead and you want to get rid of, or it's on its way out, like it's dying or it's ill, you might want to bury those items that related to that baneful working in the ground and then chop down that plant, dispose of it, including all of the soil. Now, obviously, as mentioned, make sure that this is only biodegradable things, but that is an option for having the same principle as with the prosperity, but with the counter intention. Now, when it comes to burying in the earth, you can also do it on your property or away from your property. Now, as mentioned, you have to be really careful with private property and the like, and even disposing of things on public property, but there are many traditions that do involve burying items on your property as a way of keeping the energy around, burying them away from your property as a way of removing that energy, and sometimes burying them at crossroads. Now, this varies tradition to tradition. Some people consider the crossroads to be a very neutral place, others consider it to be a highly liminal space. Some people will do this as a way of working with different spirits and deities. So Hecate is known to be a goddess of the crossroads, and this is where the cultural uniqueness and the traditional uniqueness really comes in, because what you resonate with is going to change the way you associate with things. If you don't work with Hecate as one of your goddesses, then working with the crossroads to connect with Hecate just isn't going to be for you. And so you might find that the crossroads is actually associated more with the idea of liminal space or spirit work. Maybe you have another spirit or deity that you work with instead at the crossroads. It is all very unique. So it's really important to pick the things that you think are going to work well for you out of this. You don't have to do all of it, or any of it, actually. The next option is probably the least magical on this entire list, but so many people have to do it because their circumstances don't allow for anything else. And that's fine. This is binning spell remains. Now, this can be made magical in its own way, so let's talk about that first. If you want to keep something in your life, you might want to bin it in your property. If you want to get rid of something from your life, you might want to bin it far away. Now, personally, I would typically recommend cleansing spell remains for anything positive before you put them in the bin, because ultimately they're going to end up away from your property anyway. But for any kind of baneful workings, hexes, curses, jinxes, any kind of banishing spells, if you put them in the bin away from your property with all of the energy in it, then all of that negativity is going to continue brewing long term. Now, the alternative to this is that you do genuinely just bin all of your items, no matter what they're for. For this, though, I would typically recommend giving them a good cleanse first to make sure that none of that energy is then being put into the bin, which is then going to go, elsewhere. But this is something that so many people have to do. I think it's important to remember that it is a luxury to be able to go to a crossroads. It is a luxury to be able to have a garden, and that's a luxury that a lot of people simply don't have. So binning spell remains is definitely an option. The last main technique that you can do is to hoard them. Become a spell dragon and hoard all of your spell remains. Now this might sound really, really bizarre, but it's useful if you are doing spells that you might need to undo at a later point. I wouldn't recommend keeping things for years upon years on end. I'd say for about 3 months is a pretty reasonable amount of time. It means if you've done a prosperity spell and you aren't sure if it's going to be successful and if you maybe want to add to it, you still keep those spell remains so that you can add to it at a later point. If you've done a binding spell and you're not sure whether that binding is going to stick or whether you're going to need to undo it and redo it, then keeping those remains left behind makes it way easier to undo that spell. And that also applies to spells that you just want to undo because you don't want them anymore. Perhaps you've done a working that simply isn't applicable to your life anymore, and so you don't want the energy to continue. It's a lot harder to undo that working if you've got rid of everything that is related to it. So keeping some of the items that are connected to that spell allows you to undo that working if necessary at a later point. Now, as mentioned, I typically only recommend keeping things for about 3 months. Once you go past that point, you're probably pretty steadfast on whether you want that working to manifest or not, and a lot of your workings will have already manifested by that point anyway, but it is useful for any workings that you aren't entirely sure whether they're going to be successful on. It means you can add to them or undo them at a later point. Now, lastly, we do have some honourable mentions. These are things that aren't necessarily categories in their own right. They might only be useful for 1 or 2 aspects of your craft, but you might want to implement them. One of my personal favourites is using the toilet. Now, obviously, I would not recommend putting things down the toilet that are not meant to go down the toilet, but hear me out. You are doing a working to banish someone from your life. You want to get rid of them as fast as possible. So you include a piece of toilet paper or several pieces of toilet paper in your working as your petition. You write on that toilet paper, you use that as you would a piece of parchment paper, and then at the end of that working, when all of that energy is all built up, you might want to, I don't know, use said toilet paper and then dispose of it down the toilet. If that doesn't say clearing things out of your system, I don't know what does. Now, obviously, do not put anything down the toilet that is not meant to go down the toilet. But there are ways of adjusting the spells that we are creating to fit the way we want to dispose of them. We are also able to create something new with spells that we've already carried out. So, as mentioned, the adapting spells to fit the way you want to dispose of it. If you want something to flourish in your life long term, perhaps you've just had a hand fasting and you want to do a union ritual between you and your partner for long-lasting love and happy relationships. You might want to take a sapling, or you might want to take a seed and include it as an integral part of that working. You might want to plant that seed in one of those cardboard toilet pipe things. What are they even called? You know, the inside bit of a toilet roll that's left behind at the end of it where it's made of cardboard? You might want to turn the bottom in on that. Write your sigils, your symbols, your petition on the outside of that. Put the seed with some soil inside of that. You might want to finish your working, finish your spell, take that outside, bury it on your property, water it with some moon water. You've disposed entirely of that working, but in a way that is very beneficial to the development of that spell in the long run. Now you have a spell that is linked to a plant, a little bit like we did to the basil earlier, and now it can flourish for years, decades, centuries to come, and then you can continue to water that plant with moon water as a way of developing it further. So that's a way of even further adapting a spell or ritual to the disposal technique you want to be using. Alternatively, if you have leftover moon water, you can return it to a waterway. If you have any workings that you've done with water, so water can be used to cleanse things out, it can be used for healing, you can then dispose of that appropriately. So if you want something to stagnate, to rot, to go rancid, you might want to dispose of that in stagnant water. If you want something to cleanse away, to move quickly, you might want to dispose of that in a fast-flowing river. If you want something to be quite cyclical, ebbing and flowing, you might want to dispose of that in the ocean. Once again, only do this with things that are completely safe to be doing this with. So waters, magical waters are fantastic. I'm talking specifically though about magical waters. So moon water, sun water, eclipse water. I'm not necessarily talking about things like Florida water, which isn't just water. That's lots and lots of other things, often quite strong alcohols. But if you do have any workings that involve water in that way, you can do that. Now, this also applies to things like shower rituals, bath rituals. As long as you've not used anything that isn't plant material in that water, you can take a little bit of that and you can dispose of it in a place that is most applicable for for that intention. Now, if you've used a lot of incenses in your spells and rituals, perhaps you have burned your petitions, your sigils, perhaps you've used a specific incense for a specific purpose, you can dispose of this in the wind, in the air, in the breeze, in the storm, whatever kind of air works best for you. And you can take this a step further. Not only are you releasing the energy of that working by blowing it into the wind, you can choose a direction. You can use the classical element directions, north, south, east, and west, or you can use the traditional witchcraft directions for north, south, east, and west, which do vary, to direct the intention that you want that working to manifest in. So if you want something that is very fiery, you might want the wind to be blowing to the south. Now, you might change this depending on the way you think of things. For me, if the wind is blowing to the south, it is taking it towards that fiery energy that I associate the south with being. If that wind is blowing from the south, it's actually heading north, and so it may well take it to the northern earthen energy. It's going to depend on what it is that you resonate with. The elemental directions in traditional witchcraft are different, but by doing it this way, you can add elemental associations onto the disposal of that working, which is then going to magnify the intention and the way it's going to manifest. You can do this on specific days if you're working with specific deities, such as working with Bridget on Imbolg, or working with the archetypal figures of the Holly King and the Oak King when it comes to the summer solstice and the winter solstice. You can work with solar deities during Letha and the like. You can also accompany this into storm magic. If you know that you want to dispose of something in your life, you might want to do it during really high winds, though of course always being safe. If you want to work with really strong energy, such as storm and lightning energy, you can do it as safely as you can during a lightning storm as a way of further imbuing it with your energy and intention. There's so many options with that one, but please don't do that with like random bits of materials that you know the wind is strong enough to carry away. Make sure it is only with things that are suitable for the purpose. And that is my very rapid rundown, rapid for me, I have no idea how long this video is actually going to be, of the different ways that you can dispose of spell remains. Now, of course, there's likely going to be many more different techniques, different nuanced techniques that people can use. So if you have an alternative technique, do let us know down in the comment section. It's going to help me, it's going to help everyone else to expand our knowledge a little bit further, because after all, I am just one person. I am never going to know all of the information about witchcraft. I wish, that would be cool, right? But I don't think it's going to happen in this lifetime in any way, shape, or form. So I always love hearing your opinions, your stances, your techniques, because people have very, very nuanced practices, and I love hearing all about it. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to give it a like. It really means a lot to me. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them down in the comment section. And if you do enjoy the magical content on this channel or in this video, feel free to hit subscribe. I try to post magical content every single week. And with that being said, YouTube is about to recommend you a video that it thinks is going to be best for you. I might, however, override that and recommend that you watch my Witch's Guide to Incense Magic, because if you like the idea of using the wind in disposal of spell items, you're probably going to like that video too. And with that being said, I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you have a marvelous magical day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!